So I'm thrilled that we get to spend some time this morning talking about Belize. For me, missions trips and pilgrimages, they're really transformational. I think the Celtic Christians describe them as thin spaces where the boundary between heaven and earth are particularly porous, and you can experience divine reality in a much easier way. And I also think the stories that you hear from people that spend a week together serving or exploring and traveling, I've been on experiences 20 years ago when I bumped into those people at the grocery store. We still are reminiscent. So it really is a powerful way of connection and growing in that experience of our oneness. So this morning I'm particularly excited because this is my first time in February to go to Belize with St. Luke's. I've been to Belize before, but I was vacationing and scuba diving. This is going to be a very different trip. And
you can do that.
Well, I might scuba dive. Yeah, who knows? You're right, John. Thank you for the. I've got a couple days at the beginning and a couple days at the end. I might go scuba diving. But anyway, we've got John Willard and Bishop Ann who are going to share about the history of the trip and St. Luke's history of going to Belize in this missions trip. And then we also invite, and I'm sure they will, anybody that's been to Belize before that would like to share a story. I would love to hear it. And if you're still interested, talking to Wendy last week, we still have a couple of slots open if you're interested in going. It's going to be the last week of February. All right, thanks. I don't know who's up first.
Well, I do not have slides. I do not have pictures, which is too bad because I was really young and I would much rather you see those pictures when I first went back in the 80s. Should have looked those up. So I'm going to start off just because why Belize, a little bit about why Belize. And part of that is that the Episcopal Church as a whole church-wide has always encouraged dioceses to have what we call companion relationships with other dioceses. And that I'm not sure what, I think that probably dates back to the 70s. I'm not sure exactly when that began. But the Diocese of North Carolina had its first companion diocese relationship with the Diocese of Belize, a very strong presence of the Anglican Church, being former British Honduras. The Anglican Church, the Episcopal Church being very strong. And so I first went, I came here, I think 1985. I came as an intern and then came back as a clergy person in 87. And it was very early on that I was invited to go on one of these mission trips with the diocese, with Mark Alexander, the companion diocese. And we went to Belize and just had an amazing time with this, as Greg kind of says, sort of this mystical combination of really working hard, for sure, and also really going deeper into relationships with the people of the community. Back then, and this was early on, John will get to this, we went to different communities around Belize. But also the way it changed the relationships among the people that went, but also developing relationships with the communities down in Belize, with the bishop, with the clergy. We would fly into Belize City, and then depending on where the project was going to be, we would go out. We would always end with a little fun trip out to the Keys, right? So Cape Hawker, there was always a little, dessert at the end of having some sun and some sand and some beach and some really good times. So the first time I went with people from around the diocese. The second time I went with a youth group from the diocese, which was great. And I'm going to tell a little story about that because I think one of the things that's important to know about mission trips, and for those of you who've been, you know this, but for those of you like, well, I don't know, you always feel a little bit awkward. There's just a natural sort of like, what am I doing here? And I feel a little odd, a little standing out. What's going to happen? How's this going to go? Don't know these people. There's always that little bit of nervousness. And I was in a busload of youth, Belizean youth, youth from the U.S., wonderful, big old busload, the way you would do a high school trip. We arrived in Belmopan, a farm, an agricultural tissue farm, and it's dark. It is nighttime. We're kind of stumbling off the bus. It's been a long travel day, and we're standing around waiting to get organized and sent off to our little cabins. And it's a farm, right? And there's farm animals, and I'm thinking, ooh, yeah, wow, you can really smell those cows. Yeah, wow, it really smells bad. And I'm like, I don't know what's going on, but we're just going to be good, polite Americans And so we've been standing around, we went to our cabins, and I realized I had all over my shoes. Yes. And I had on this really cute outfit. And what I had done, I had probably put my foot up against a fence post like this, you know, and then at some point had leaned back. I had stuff. And you know, I don't know how old I was, but I was 13 in my brain. And I was embarrassed, and I was like, I'm a leader, and I've already literally stepped in it, and I said, I'm gonna be a leader. This is why I never say I do this. You know, it was like it was back on. And it was all part of it, right? It's just all part. There is some things a little bit humbling, or at least it should be. Because the last thing we were is coming in to save anybody. I mean, I think that's one thing to get across about what these things are about. These, if there are any evangelism, there's certainly no proselytizing, meaning I'm going to tell you what I believe because that's what you should believe too, right? That's what proselytizing. Here's what I believe, and whatever else you believe, it better look like what I believe, or else there's something wrong with you. That's proselytizing. Evangelizing gets a bad rap. That is about saying, here's the force in my life that gives me life. And this is just my story. This is just my story, but I'm also very interested in your story. Right? So, but mission trips are not about converting anybody except ourselves, right? Again and again, converting ourselves in humility. Now, hopefully not with humiliation, for that may happen, but really having a strong sense of, I have so very little to offer, and yet whatever I have to offer to this trip, God's going to multiply it into a blessing, and I just have to be patient enough and humble enough to wait and see how that happens. So I started off with Belize trips, so one of the smartest, and I went a second, so I went those 2 times, and then I just started sending other people. I'm like, come on, you should go, you should go, you should go. And then one of the smartest things I ever did a few smart things, was to get Jean and John Willard involved with the Episcopal Center at Duke. And many of you all also became involved, but John and Jean particularly, and I talked John into start to go on these trips. And so John started going, and we went to Honduras mostly. And then one year, you did take a Duke trip to Belize, right? You took Leslie in that group.
Yeah, that was.
What year was that?
That was after we started. St. Luke started.
Because you started in 2000, so maybe 2003, 2004. But anyway, so John was seeing all these things happen with the Duke students. And started realizing this is really a powerful way to create community. And I guess that's really, and then John started leading the St. Luke trips. I think that's really the point I want to kind of conclude on as I pass the baton, is, you know, Greg talked about the liminal spaces, which I so agree with. And there's always a spiritual dimension. I think some mission trips have a more explicit spiritual dimension trip than others. Sometimes that's more talked about, sometimes that's less talked about. But here's the thing I think always happens. Everything that we do in Belize, whether it's construction or sharing a meal, you know, and let's just say it, maybe our construction skills are fine and maybe our construction skills are a little shaky. It's not like Belizeans haven't built things before, right? But what we're constructing is community. And community, I'd like to get to know you better. I would say mission trips at their best have a deeply sacramental nature. They are outward and visible signs of God's inward and spiritual grace to create a new community. Every mission trip has its own kind of unique, you know, it's told in stories, like stepping in stuff. But those stories are always just out in terms of saying something happened that brought me closer to other people and closer to God, and maybe closer to an authentic journey on my part. Something about my faith has deepened. And I think that's the real benefit. And when I certainly, as John's going to explain, the benefits to, as we kind of zeroed in on this one community, Holy Cross, the benefits of a school, a chapel, I mean, these outward and visible signs of incredibly transformative vessels of mission are amazing. But I will also say the transformation happened back at St. Luke's, that there was something about those trips, you know, each year that brought people of St. Luke's closer together here, but also reaching out more in Pilgrim community. It was never just about Belize. It was never just about Holy Cross. I don't think. What I saw was that this church, as we grew in relationship and community, a unity of traveling with, that spirit was carried back into whatever endeavors, outreach endeavors, that this community, St. Louis, got involved in. Whether it was working with people who've been recently incarcerated, whether it was Habitat, there was a different kind of spirit and a camaraderie, right? I mean, that was the other thing, that there was a sense of camaraderie that kept growing and growing and growing. So I really can't recommend this trip enough, or any trips like it, where you get this chance. It's not just about a building, it's not just about a school, it's not just about construction, but it is about allowing God to do something new within us, among us, and create some new level of community. And I'm happy to hand it over to John at that point. Or whoever I'm handing it over.
No, I'm just trying to help you technologically.
I didn't touch it.
This is not.
Maybe you should have.
You have to invest in the top of it.
Hey. Oh. Hey.
It's a miracle.
Well, thank you, Ann. I'm glad to be here when they announced that they were having this adult forum. They called Winnie and said, I would be interested to transmit to you, most of you people who weren't in these first years, there's a few of us here, how it all started. How did we get involved in Belize? And so it really started when I was, like Ann said, when I was in Honduras with the chapel, with the chapel. Abigail Nelson, who is from ERD, was there, and at the same place where we were working. And she's just a delightful young woman. She's not so young anymore, like the rest of us. And
Hey, John, just make sure that you touch your touchpad so it doesn't shut down your computer.
oh yes.
Yeah, just keep this every so
Yeah.
often. Touch
Okay, so so then when I got involved with Ann at the Episcopal Center, that's the reason I was in Honduras, I said, well, geez, we should do something in St. Louis. So I called Abigail to see what other places there were available, and she said, well, there's a lot of stuff going on in Belize, would you be interested in that? And at the time, I didn't even know that we had, in the past or even currently, were in a relationship with the diocese. So anyway, that's how it started. A little bit of history about the Anglican Diocese of Belize. It's part of the province of the West Indies, which is most of the Caribbean plus part of Central America. The cathedral is in Belize City. It's a beautiful, beautiful brick building. I don't think everybody has had the opportunity that's gone to Belize to worship there, but a lot of us have. The interesting thing about it was, as you travel around Belize, everything's built with cinder blocks or wood. Never do you see brick, red brick. Well, it turns out that the red brick that St. John's Cathedral was built was ballast in the ships coming from the UK. took the brick off and they put on mahogany. So the ballast from the ship is what built that cathedral, which is just an interesting relationship between the Church of England, if you want to say, and building the cathedral in Belize City. There are 31 churches in the diocese. The relationship between church and state, particularly with the schools, is very tight. All but a few of the schools are operated by the churches, various churches, Catholic Church, the Episcopal Church, the Methodist Church, whatever. And they are basically responsible for the physical plant, for the secretary of the school, for the custodian of the school, if they have a cantina, for the people that make the food. But the teachers and the principal are paid for by the state. So it's a very different relationship. But it's really kind of a neat relationship, at least what we got. So one of the other things that we did with the diocese is they had a guest house in Belize City, just down the block from the cathedral. And frequently we'd spend maybe the first night in the guest house. And it was, upstairs for the ladies and downstairs for the guys, but it was still fun to do. The volunteer coordinator at the time was Frances Wilson. And so we got to know her right up front before we actually went out to where we were going to work. And I come back to Frances a little late. The construction supervisor was Steve Babbs. And for those of us who interacted with Steve, we had a lot of fun. He was kind of a character in his own right, but he was responsible for getting all of the materials that we needed, and most of the time we had all the materials we needed. Not all the time. The things that reoccurred with each event through these years was we always either had evening prayer or compline at the end of the day, which allowed us to take what we had experienced and put it closer to the church and closer to our hearts. The other great experience is we usually went out even when we were working on the mainland. We went out to Keekwalker or someplace to go snorkeling. And to get there, we had to go on a water taxi. And the water taxi frequently was a real experience. It went like a bat out of you-know-where, and didn't matter how big the waves were. And I remember one of the first trips that we went, there were 2 or 3 people that sat in the back of the boat. Well, the waves were big. By the time we got to Keekwalker, they were soaking wet. So we had those interesting things. The other repeating thing is we almost always went to a Mayan ruin. So we went to three different Mayan ruins while we were there. So let's get started here. The first trip was to Keekwalker, which is one of the barrier islands. We worked on building new homes that had been destroyed by Hurricane Keith. Our team, here's the team from 2002. Jim and Joanne were there. Jean and I were there. Wade Gresham was there. It was the one and only time Wade went, and he enjoyed it. Joyce Avery, bless her heart, was there. The Blaylocks were there, and then Michael White and Josh Werner were there also. That's the crew, plus the young boy in the front middle was one of the workers that Mr. Babbs had brought with him. And this is where we were working on building a house. It was pretty interesting. Not only did we build a house, but one of the more interesting things is we also built a septic tank. Well,
We always put the septic.
no. Anyway, we built a septic tank. that's okay. You say, okay, you build a septic tank. But the problem is that most of the land that was cleared used to be vegetated. So there were roots in the ground. Well, when they cleared it, they just cut it off at the thing, brought in some sand and covered it up. So when you started to dig a hole for a septic tank, just like ants experiences. But it wasn't that, but it was rotting plant material. So it was really an interesting experience digging that. Other things, we stayed at Daisy's Hotel, which was a very basic hotel on the beach. One thing that we all remember was the Sandbox. There was a restaurant right near where the hotel was, and we ate almost all of our meals there, and it was a good experience. We snorkeled with Johnny's Tours, who we snorkeled with, I think, one other time after this. And we also went to the Mayan ruin at Lamini, which we went to several times. An interesting thing about going to the Mayan ruin at Lamini is we took a boat up the river to Lamini. And so even that was an experience in and of itself. We'd see monkeys and we'd see all kinds of birds, and people used to give me a hard time about saying I recognized the bird and say what bird it was. And I said, Gene, write it down. Gene, write it down. And I always got kidded about doing that. So
and flower, you did plants too.
Plants too.
You had her writing that down too.
That's true.
John, where did the materials come for building the house? I see cinder blocks behind you.
Cinder blocks, yeah.
Yeah. Are they down in Belize already?
They're made in Belize.
They're made in Belize.
They make them in Belize. In fact, I recall when one of the trips that I was at in Honduras, we were making cinder blocks. So it's a common occurrence. And here we are. This is the cement mixer. Then we went to St. Barnabas School in Central Farms. We went in June, which was, in one regard, a mistake, but I'll get to that. So the school was in Central Farms, which is about 65 miles west of Belize City, on the main highway. And we were adding a computer room onto St. Barnabas School. So predominantly what we did that year was to build the foundation. This is the team. The Larsons, some of you, the Larsons went here for a long time, but then they moved to the beach, and other people that you might not recognize there that aren't around anymore. This is us at the school with a couple of the workers too. This is the foundation. You can see where we put cinder block around the edges and through the middle. And then that big grid of rebar was what the ladies were famous for. They wired every intersection of rebar in order, and it was, you can see that's one that all got wired in one section. And then we mixed the cement and poured the cement on the foundation. And that's the kids from St. Barnabas School. The other interesting thing was we stayed at Casablanca Hotel, which was really quite a nice hotel. The only thing that wasn't so nice is all the rooms were on the second floor. And above the second floor was a flat roof. And we were there in June. And the cement from that roof re-radiated onto our beds all night long. But we survived. We went to the Mayan ruin of Caracol, which is a rather smaller one, but we went there. And we also met Nancy and Lindsay Walton. He was the rector of the church in San Ignacio. Interesting family. She was a redhead, and here you were with all these mostly Hispanic children and some African American children. so she was assisting him in his being the rector there. They subsequently were rectors, and he was a rector at church in Sparta, North Carolina. They had a little girl when we were there. She was 2 or 3, I guess, maybe 3 or 4. And they subsequently adopted a Belizean child, or a little boy. The next one, we went to Willowbanks Church and Doublehead Catholic School in 2004. That's about 35 miles northwest from Belize City. And we were again working on a foundation. That year we stayed in bungalows at a resort. They were little kind of cabins, so they were nice.
But they didn't have any hot water.
Right, no hot water. See, that's what I want you to do. Bring up these wonderful things that I and we went to the baboon, that's it, not bamboo, baboon sanctuary, which is a misnomer. That's what it's called, but it actually was a place from where they had howler monkeys. And if you've ever been to a place where there are howler monkeys, they sometimes can be quite loud. And so they were howling at us frequently. This is the team. Jacobi's, this is the first year that Jan Land went. Wayne Lowe there. So there we built the foundation and started on the walls. It was interesting, the ladies got to do something that they were really, I don't think they really liked, but they did it with a smile. We put the cinder block on, but then we put cement down into the cinder block holes, and then they would, to settle the cement into the cinder block, they were all handed a stick, and the stick ladies would push the cement down into the cinder block hole, so that it was like, we called them all the stick ladies.
But John, there were a couple of days, more than one, I don't know how many, where some of us stayed at the school.
Right.
And there was one day at that school, I was working with the 4th grade, and they were talking about angles. And I couldn't remember the angles until one of the kids told me. But then the teacher comes up to me and says, I'm going to a meeting, you're in charge. So what do I teach them? Well, I decided not to teach them anything. I made them teach me about Belize. And they thought that was wonderful.
Yeah.
So again, in all these situations too, the cement mixers were us. And in this case, the floor of the church we were working on was what, about that high? So we had to wheelbarrow up a ramp in order to pour the floor, and then also wheelbarrow the mortar up the ramp too in order to work on the cinder blocks. So more of the same. So construction was a big part of what we did in the early years. Then we went to St. Andrew's School in St. Ignace. That's where we stayed the first year. And we stayed in the same hotel, but now we're in February. So the hotel was just fine. In this school, interestingly enough, a lot of the classrooms were on the 2nd floor. And we were building, like it says, a library and a computer room on the 2nd floor, which meant that everything had to be carried up one floor. The cinder blocks, the cement, everything had to be carried up one floor. This is the team. This is the first year that our daughter went, Gretchen. This is to the left is the computer room. That's our daughter sitting on the bottom thing there, those of you who don't know, right? Again, you can see, here we are on the second floor with the cement mixer. And in 2006, we went south in 2006 to St. Michael's and All Angels in Mango Creek, about 112 miles due south of Belize City. So it was a pretty good trek to get down there. And what we were doing was mostly finishing work on a church, both inside and outside. This is the team. This is the first year the chaplains went. And Sarah Glauchamp is the daughter of one of Jan Lamb's best friends. So,
And she was deaf.
yeah,
Sarah. Yeah.
Sarah was deaf, yes. I couldn't get quotes a group picture, but this is the group picture. And I had to bring these. This is a Billigan necklace. Just for my friend Wayno. We enjoyed the local beer, let's put it that way.
And they let you run a tab.
What?
They let you run a tab for the whole week.
Oh.
You didn't have to pay each day.
So it was good. I think over the years in continuing, we did consume a bit of Billigans, but it was fun. This is some of the finishing work inside. And outside. In 2007, for the first time, we were at Holy Cross School. And it was a pretty interesting experience, I have to say. For those of you who aren't familiar, it is on the island of San Pedro, or actually the city of San Pedro. It's on the island of Ambergris Key, and the school was built adjacent to the poorest part of San Pedro, what they called San Mateo. People were living in, I don't know how you, in order to get from one house to the other, you had to walk on a boardwalk over the swamp. So the houses were literally built on the swamp. There were no roads whatsoever when we were there the first year. But there would be, quotes, a road where the boardwalk was this wide instead of the boardwalk to your house, which was this wide. And
You didn't want to pass anybody.
no, you couldn't pass anybody. The school had started the year before, and the story behind the school is, I find, a rather interesting one. What catalyzed the school and why it started is Frances Wilson and her husband Vernon. He had a cabin cruiser, and they're from the Diocese of Southern Virginia, and they had driven, steered, whatever you do with a boat, ships, had gone down to Belize, and he had his boat moored out on San Pedro, near San Pedro. And they had noticed when they were out there that during the time that kids should be in school, there were kids in the street. And so they investigated that and found out that there just wasn't enough classroom space for the children that were there.
And they were charged. Children were charged to go to school.
Yeah, children, yeah. That's typical. They at least pay a little bit to go to school. So they went to the bishop and said, this is the circumstance out in San Pedro, and we think we need to do something about it. And if you remember back what I talked about, the church and state, school and state are very closely knit. And so they convinced the bishop to start a school, which is Holy Cross Anglican School, which we've been going to since 2007, pandemic. We had 2 teams that went down in subsequent 2 different weeks. This was the first week. With some of the kids. This was the second week. And as I said, we were working on the classrooms predominantly. And one of the interesting things is we were there, we got to working, and Vernon wasn't there. So we wondered, okay, where's Vernon? Well, Francis said, well, Vernon's in Belmont, which is the capital of Belize, which is 60 miles west of Belize City. And he was talking to the federal education people. So then Vernon shows back up at Inverness Key, and he said, well, I promised the manager of the schools of all of Belize that we would open this classroom by Friday. Well, it was barely a skeleton of a room. I think the beams were up, but there was no roof. So we had a lot to do. We did the roofing. We did the wiring. The Hulu wiring was Jim. We did the drywall, and we did the painting. And there were 2 classrooms that were functioning when we got there. And one of the classrooms had sheets dividing the classroom in half, flipped over a rope, so they could teach whichever it was, class 2 and class 3, but they were in the same room. So the idea was to get one of those classes into a new room, which we did accomplish, and it was really exciting. They cut the ribbon, and those kids went in there, and they were so excited. And as were we were pretty darn excited too. It was just really an amazing thing. What a challenge that we got, and we met the challenge. But in addition to meeting that challenge, we also worked on decking. Decking in Belize, or at least at Holy Cross School. I can't even remember the name of the wood, but the wood is about that thick, and the decking, that wide, about that wide. But I can promise you, you can't drive a nail into it. It is so dense, it sinks when you put it in water.
Wow.
It sinks when you put it in water. So we sometimes we were successful, but most of the time we had to drill a pilot hole and then drive the nail. So you can see that would take a lot of effort, but it's beautiful wood, and it lasts a long time. But anyway, that was part of it. And then also the cantina, we worked on the cantina. The ladies were already cooking lunch in just kind of a corner somewhere. So as part of the cantina was not only for places where they could sit and eat, but it was to be a full-fledged kitchen, which was there when we went the next year. And when we were at Holy Cross, we always got lunch when we were there. They always cooked us lunch, and we got really pretty close with the ladies in the kitchen too. So it was a really good experience. So that's the history of how we got to Holy Cross School. It's changed immensely. I haven't been there since COVID. Actually, before then, when Bob took over we didn't go. And so a lot has happened. There's now a church. There's now actually flushing toilets. What else have we built? Oh, the computer room, which was a real experience for us. That was our first experience of putting pilings in. Well, you have to remember, all of Holy Cross School is built on swampland. The city gave us the land, but it was swampland. So you had to bring in sand in order to have something to even walk on. And then you had to get the pilings to hold this building, had to go to coral. So I don't know, we were going down 4 or 5 feet? Yeah. And we were using the old hydraulic method. The old hydraulic method is you dig a little bit of a hole with a shovel, then you put the piling in that hole, then you put water, run water into the hole, which makes the sand go like this, and then you beat that piling down into the sand. So these big guys, not me, these big guys were grabbing the piling like this. So it was tough work, but it was done. It was good, and we did get a really nice computer room. The first room, well, that and the office were the only 2 rooms, and I think it still are the only 2 rooms that are air conditioned. So that's my...
I'd like to offer one thing.
Yes.
He was talking about the school rooms. You have to remember, there were no desks in these rooms. There were no chairs in these rooms. You sat on the floor. And many of the kids in those classrooms didn't even know what a school was. And I happened to be working with they call it Form 2, which is about 2nd grade, but I had a 13-year-old in that classroom because he had never been to school. And the class that day was adjectives. Now, you think about how someone who has never been to school, how do you explain what an adjective was? And by the end of the week, all of a sudden the light went on in that little boy's head, and he realized what I was teaching him. And before I left, I got a hug from that young man. And that was probably the best thing I ever did.
John, how do the people that attend these trips acquire the skills that are required for construction work? Are there people that teach that?
No.
A little bit, yeah. What's the guy's name? And that's Freddie. Freddie had a lot of good basic skills, and he would teach you. Some of us had worked habitat, so we had the skills from working habitat, but you just did it. They showed you how to do it, and you learned quickly. And they were good about telling us when we did it wrong and made us do it over, because it was important that it was done right. But we basically, there was no, Construction 101 before we left for Belize. Any other questions? I highly recommend that you go. It's a wonderful experience, and you'll get to go to a Mayan ruin, and you'll get to go snorkeling. And what more could you want?